Well, good morning. I'm so glad that you've made it up from the morning after St. Paddy's Day. That wasn't a good choice, was it?
No.
And to those from outside Boston, welcome to our fair city. And you're getting at least a glimpse of what we've had to deal with for the last month in terms of temperatures. So we're going to talk about Agile and Architecture. And this is a topic that's it's been a long-running topic. And that right from the very beginnings of the Agile software movement, there was a question of what kind of role is there for architecture. Back at the very first Agile-oriented conference in 2000, I actually talked on that topic and said, there is a role for design, as I called it, but it's different to what we normally expect. And in order to really understand that, we've really divided our talk into two main parts. In the first part, we'll actually talk about what on earth is architecture in the first place. And in the second part, we'll focus more on the question of how do you ensure that architecture is happening on your project.
So, like Martin said, Agile as a practice and principles have been around for a while. And the principles have been developed into several practices that focus maybe in the team space, a lot of things around user stories or paired programming, but when you bring in a lot of teams that are doing Agile and being Agile, how do you make sure that architecture is still happening? So first, the definition of architecture. On a whole, just as a definition, it deals with organization, planning, having core structural elements.
But it's also a kind of troubling word. I've tended to actively avoid the word architecture a lot in my writing. I tend to use design instead. At ThoughtWorks, we're very nervous about talking about architects and architecture. Very few people like to put architect on a business card. And that's partly because of the nature of what we often run into, particularly in larger companies, where people with the word architect on their title often seem very divorced from the realities of software development on a day-to-day basis. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the case.
So when I think of architecture, I think of a few things. Usually when we're talking about architecture, and we do talk about it, we tend to discuss things that are hard to change, things that might be expensive in ways of money, or expensive in hard to change.
Yeah, and this actually goes to a particularly memorable discussion about what the nature of architecture is. It was on one of the Agile or Extreme Programming mailing lists. I remember Grady Booch talking about what was the traditional definition of the time. It was a high-level view of the components and interconnections. And there was then pushback over that, saying, well, is that really a good definition? And this led to, amongst other things, the hard-to-change notion, which I think is a very good one. But I think it was taken a step further very nicely by Ralph Johnson, when he said, well, actually, architecture is the important stuff, whatever that happens to be. And it happens to be that important issues, the things that you have to care about a lot, do often correlate with stuff that's hard to change. And this was reinforced really nicely by a fairly obscure talk that we saw again in an early XP conference by an Italian economist. And he was primarily talking about lean manufacturing and some of the effects of that. But one of the things that he brought out was that one of the core drivers of complexity is irreversibility. If you can't change your mind and go back, that then constrains you very much. It makes dealing with situations very complex. And his comment was, in fact, that the traditional manufacturing processes, the traditional production line, it tried to deal with complexity by reducing how many states the system could get into, while lean manufacturing focused on trying to remove that problem of irreversibility. By making steps reversible, you could simplify things. And that, I think, is a very good way of thinking about the importance of this hard-to-change notion.
So Neil kind of hit on the next point we want to talk about when he said that architecture is a large nebulous thing that we could talk about. We could talk about a lot of things when we say architecture, and they've only given us 40 minutes to talk. So we have divided architecture into two different areas, application and enterprise. And we want to be clear about what one we're going to talk about. We want to focus on application architecture. There are a lot more things that can go into enterprise-level architecture, but for this talk, we want to make sure that we're thinking about architecture on an application level.
And of course, when we say that, we have to say, well, what do we mean by an application? It's a fairly fuzzy term. I like to think of it as there are three sort of main things that drive boundaries of an application. One is a code base and a team of developers working on some common code base. Second is a cluster of functionality that's perceived as a single thing by its users. And then third, and perhaps the most important, a single source of funding, because applications tend to have a single group or organization funding channel that drives into it.
So with those boundaries, we want to go back to architecture and then think about the agile piece of it. How do you make it a little bit more flexible, a little bit easier to change? So to do that, we want to think a little bit about what is agile and some of the principles of the manifesto, and then also how has architecture been done traditionally. So first, one of the principles of agile, which is working software over documentation. I think I had a question asked to me in an interview yesterday, which was, is there a perception that architecture does not apply to Agile? And I think one of the reasons for that is some of these principles, I think, instead of being interpreted as we want working software over documentation, they've been interpreted as we want working software and no documentation. So if we think about traditional architecture, we might think of it as in the waterfall sense. So this is a diagram that kind of shows what waterfall might happen and what phases there are. Now, these discrete phases have outputs of some sort. And documentation is often one of those outputs. For example, the design phase, like Martin was calling architecture, might have architectural diagrams as an output. So when you think about what Agile is saying to say working software over documentation, or what I think a lot of people interpret it as working software and no documentation, it kind of raises the question, well, are we doing architecture? In a sense, I want to change this diagram and show you what it kind of looks like when we think about it in an Agile fashion. So we bring it all together, and that even kind of asks the question a little bit more, well, how do you have any time to do architecture? How do you have any time to think about architecture? Well, instead of discrete phases where we're having some output at each level, we want to be thinking about the value that we're creating in each one and repeating that in Agile.
And it's important to realize that this is not just true of the activities, but in the traditional waterfall sense, you do all your design, you do all your architecture, and then you finish it and hand it over to the programmers. It's not just that. It's also that the separation in terms of people, that the people who do it are different, or are organized differently, and they don't have much collaboration. While in an Agile team, it's much more close-knit. I mean, yes, you will have people who are taking an architect's role, but they are much more a team lead within a group of developers. And everybody is, to some extent, thinking about architecture and thinking about the day-to-day programming as well. Certainly, the lead, the architect, has much more of the architecture responsibilities and is doing much more of that kind of thinking, but they're also still doing a certain amount of day-to-day development work at the same time. My view has always been, if you're going to be a lead on a development team, you have to be doing some programming.
That's why I'm on the stage, by the way.
Yeah, somebody has to actually be doing real work on this stage.
So, coming back to diagrams and outputs and what value they had, what is it providing? I personally don't think that waterfall would have had a design phase, and doing waterfall would have a design phase without having value. It's going to provide some value. But what is it lacking? So when you think about having an output and then moving on to the next phase and separate people, then you have to think about what happens when you learn something else and something has to change. So another principle in the Agile Manifesto is responding to change over having a plan. Now I'm going to say this in a different way again, responding to change and having no plan. That's one way that people interpret that statement. And I've heard different synonyms for Agile, which is the wild, wild west or cowboy coding. So we're not going to have any architecture, no plan, nothing. That's not actually true. What we want to be thinking about, instead of having a plan that's set in stone, we want something that can change and we can iterate on. We want the value of a diagram, something that can communicate things, but something that can also change.
And that changeability, I think, raises some questions about the whole metaphor of architecture itself. I mean, the reason we use the word architecture is we're drawing a metaphor from the construction industry. And as in typical with software development, we got the metaphor completely wrong. Because in the software, in the building industry, what an architect does is concentrates on the experience of people working and using in the building. I mean, if we were to say what is the equivalent of an architect in software development, it would be user experience designers. It wouldn't be anybody concerned with the internal design of a system. I'm very conscious of this because I'm married to someone who does do that work. She's a structural engineer. And that's completely different to architects. And I can tell you, traditionally, structural engineers and architects get on just about as well as the average programmer and enterprise architect does in our industry. So I think a better metaphor for what architecture should be like in the software world was put up as a nice little talk you can hunt around on YouTube by another colleague of ours, Eric Durnenberg. And the talk is called Architecture Without Architects. And what his point of view is that if you're going to look for a metaphor, a better metaphor for architecture is city planning. Because with city planning, you've got something that's much more dynamic and vibrant. Things are changing all the time in city planning, and you have to react to that while at the same time trying to keep some kind of coherence across the whole picture. It's important to have some kind of planning activity, because otherwise you end up with an overly chaotic city. But at the same time, you can't come up with a design and let it set, because things are always going to change around you. And I think that's a much better metaphor for what software architecture is about.
So Martin introduced the talk as two parts. We've talked a little bit about what is architecture. But so if architecture is happening when you're working in an agile fashion, how do you make sure of that? How do you know?
And this is important because, yes, it is very possible for agile projects and any kind of project to suffer because of the fact that architecture isn't occurring. One of the examples I always point back to is a ThoughtWorks project from about 10 or so years ago, where we were building this big system. It had multiple teams in multiple countries. And somebody looked in and did a review of it and found we had 3 completely different incompatible object relational mapping frameworks being used in different parts of the code. Now, that didn't stop the project from being successful. It was a very successful project. But it certainly caused more trouble than we otherwise would have had we got a bit more discipline across the whole picture. And that is where a lack of architecture can get you into difficulties. And so it is important to pay that continuous attention, like the city planner, to make sure that things are coherent.
So we want to take you through a few activities that we think are examples of where architecture is happening in agile software development that you might not have thought of, or you might not be getting the value or the architectural thinking out of them that you could still get. Because it's not all about diagrams, and it's definitely, Agile's all about collaboration and communication over things like documentation. So one of the first things that we want to talk about is something we at ThoughtWorks call an Inception, but you could also call it something like a kickoff or just the start of a project or a product. So what happens in an inception is typically all the key stakeholders get together. And sometimes we've seen that architects are left out of that meetings. So why is that? Well, people aren't valuing architecture the way we should. We are not thinking about it as something that is important or things that are hard to change. We want to be talking about that early on in the phase of the project.
And this is, I think, one of the interesting shifts that you need to make when you think of things in terms of an agile context as opposed to the traditional one. In the traditional context, what do we do at the beginning of a project? Well, we want to make all the important decisions because we have to get all those decisions right early on. But in an agile context, you want to kind of do almost the reverse of this. You want to say to yourself, how can we stop things becoming architectural? How can we make things, and what I mean by that, how do we make what seems like an irreversible thing reversible? So one great example of this was, again, an early ThoughtWorks project. We were one of the early projects that was trying to use an agile approach with traditional relational databases. And a lot of database people said to us, well, yeah, you can do all this agile stuff on the code, but the database schema has to be defined at the beginning because it's a right pain in the neck to change. So you've got to fix that. You've got to go through and get a full data model. I remember being in sessions where people were trying to come up with these data models. But fortunately, we were saved by one of our colleagues, Pramod Sadalji, who questioned that whole approach and said, well, you say the database is hard to change. Well, let's work on that. Let's try and figure out how to make it easy to change. And he came up with a scheme that said, well, the database gets modified by a series of migrations, where each migration is very small. It might be splitting a single field into two separate columns or something of that kind, or moving a column from over here to over there. And every change not just changes the schema, but migrates any data within that, so you have the necessary DDL to migrate the data. And then that way, you can change the schema steadily all the time. And you might have a database out there in production, but you can still change it to a new version by running the migrations. And if you've used tools like Liquibase or Rails migrations or things like that, you're familiar with how this scheme works now. And in fact, this is how we work on pretty much all our projects, right? Yeah, we're still doing it, good. But that was because of the fact that Pramod said, well, let's take something that's seen to be irreversible and make it reversible. And what does that do? It means that the database schema is no longer an architectural concern. Right? It's no longer hard to change. The best architects remove architecture by figuring out how to make things shiftable. I'll throw in another example as well, that of contracts between systems that serve different services. I remember talking to somebody, there was a big noise in the SOA world, and he was saying, well, service contracts, they have to be fixed up front because they're so hard to change. And immediately, all my spidey bells went off and said, hang on, that must be a problem. And again, I keep mentioning our colleagues, but we do seem to be a bit single-minded on this. And Ian Robinson came up with a technique of consumer-driven contracts, which allows you to change service contracts more easily. So again, the hard part to get up front is to say, where are the things that are hard to change, and how can we make them easy to change? Do that, and you get a very big win.
And I'll just add in one more thing, is during an inception, I like to make sure that everyone in the room kind of agrees on what is hard to change. They vary based on a lot of factors: organization size, capability, things like timelines. If timelines are really short or really pressing on the project, there are some other things that might be hard to change. So defining that up front and having an agreement, not only from technical stakeholders, but from business stakeholders, and their understanding about what is hard to change, and then also what might be easier to change and what might change in the future if we learn more. Having that up front, having an idea, is always a good thing to start with. The next thing we wanted to talk about was stories. In Agile teams, especially ours, we write stories to break down functionality and deliver it incrementally. The stories are usually based on user value. Well, architecture has user value as well, and change to the architecture should also be tracked and shown what value we're adding or what we're changing as we go along. A lot of the times after inceptions, we will have written down or documented some spikes that we want to do. The definition of spikes are exploring these things that are hard to change and figuring out maybe the path that we want to take. If we have some ideas, what do we want to explore so we know, is it hard to change, or is it something that we can decide later at the more responsible moment?
And in doing this, what you're doing is allowing the team to talk about what are the key things in the software system. And this reinforces what I think is a very key point. The architecture of a system doesn't lie in any architecture diagrams or any other static artifacts that are produced. That doesn't mean they're not useful, as we'll mention later on, but they are just one representation of the architecture and not the most important one. The most important one is the shared understanding between the people in the team as to how the system fits together. Kent Beck had a very nice little test he would do as a consultant. He would wander around teams and say, describe to me how the system works using only 4 objects. And he said that if he did that, and most people picked the same or roughly the same 4 objects, he knew they had a good coherence across the whole team. But if everybody was telling him a completely different set of 4 objects, then he knew there was no coherence. So the architecture might be written down or on a diagram or something, but it wasn't in people's heads. And that's where the most important place for architecture is. It's in the heads of everybody who's taking part in it.
The other thing around stories or incrementally changing functionality that deals with architecture is acknowledging the fact that as you're working on a story, you may be dealing with architectural changes, not only when it's an architecture-related story, but something that's the new feature. And creating and changing architecture is happening while you're paired programming or just developing a new feature on your own even. So thinking about architecture in someone's head, it's happening as you're going along and changing the software.
And one of the best architectural elements is something that people often forget, which is example areas of the code. Particularly when you're beginning an iteration and you're thinking about the stories that are going to be played in that iteration, it's often useful to say, you're going to be accessing the flubber-the-nub system. Go to this module over here. That's an excellent example of how that should be done well. People, when they are writing code, they often look to examples that are currently in the code base and use them as inspiration for how to do things. And so what you want to do is to try and make sure that the really good bits are the ones that are highlighted, and people copy those. They don't copy the half attempt that you made when you didn't really understand what was going on, but you haven't got round to fixing up yet. It's really important to highlight the exemplar parts of the code. And they actually then become very important drivers in architecture if that's done.
On our teams, we usually have these things that we call showcases, where we are showing off new functionality, how things have changed for a product. Included in this is sometimes technical aspects of the technology, aspects of how the code is working. This is an example of a tool called Gatling, which is a performance metrics tool. And we showed this in some of our showcases because we want to also highlight different pieces of how the code is working, how the architecture is working. And in this particular project, it was very important that we have a performance that met, we were replacing a system, so we wanted to meet or exceed the performance of the current system. So being able to show aspects of architecture and technical thinking in showcases makes us also remember that the architecture and thinking about how we're implementing the code to solve these business problems is important, and it's important to help us not step on our own toes later on by thinking about what kinds of things we are designing for. Another aspect of that Martin kind of hinted on that I want to talk about is what some people might call meetings, but I'm going to call collaboration. So on a lot of projects I've been on, we do something called a mob code review or a mob code refactoring. I think there are a lot of different ways that within a team you can collaborate on changing the code and, if you want, changing your architectural path.
And we've focused a lot on collaboration and talking, and a lot of it we've given face-to-face examples, such as Inception meetings or iteration planning meetings, or just the fact that the team is physically together, which allows a lot of face-to-face communication. And we accent this a lot because our observation follows with that from original Agilists who feel that you get the highest bandwidth and fidelity of communication when you're actually physically co-located. For most people, not necessarily for all people, but I think for the majority of people. But collaboration isn't just face-to-face stuff. A lovely example of collaboration and a role for an architect that I came across on one of our projects was the tech lead, the architect. He made sure that he booked a certain amount of time every week for reviewing code commits. 2 or 3 times a week, or I can't remember, roughly that kind of frequency, he would sit down, spend a couple of hours, and go through all the commits that had gone into the code base. He wouldn't necessarily look at in detail at every one. He would triage them a bit. He would say, oh, yeah, I know this developer, he's really good, or whatever, or I know this other developer, a bit more iffy. Well, this developer here, she's normally really sharp, but she doesn't know this area of the code base terribly well, so maybe I'll take a look here. Went through in that kind of way, reviewing certain commits. And then if he found something that he wasn't too happy with, he'd say, oh, OK, I need to spend some time, pair with that developer, and show them how I think it ought to be done instead. And this isn't a face-to-face thing so much, except, of course, the pairing later on. But again, it's a role of making sure that the architect is able to see what's actually going on in the project and get a sense of what's going on in there. And this is, I think, a really important point, because one of the things that always amused me about the traditional waterfall style is that when the architects or designers came up with a grand design, nobody ever asked them to look to see if the code that was written actually matched it when it had been written. And when I mentioned that to my wife, the structural engineer, her reaction was really surprised. That, well, in proper construction engineering, you always go and look to see if the construction people have done what have been said, because half the time they won't. You have to be keeping an eye on that. Sometimes just out of ignorance, sometimes for other reasons. But it's part of your responsibility to look to see what happened. Partly because, of course, you want to ensure that the plans were carried out, but also so that you can learn, so that you can see what worked and what doesn't work. You can't disengage yourself from the process. By reviewing commits, the architect, that gives you one mechanism to see what's actually happening on the ground and to see if some of the decisions being made early on are actually panning out in practice.
That technique was suggested to me as something that I could do when I first started as a tech lead at one of my projects. And that was also done on a distributed team between Cincinnati, Ohio, and Bangalore, India. So it also is very good to look at commits, and that will help spark different conversations between distributed teams or between 2 areas or several different areas. I think it's a really good technique to use to say, oh, I just saw this, and then that starts a conversation about how the code is changing and the kind of plan that you're working towards. So come back to this diagram again, and the last thing that we want to talk about is plans are okay. And oftentimes in our offices we have big whiteboards that are all of the walls, and there's always a drawing on them, whether or not it is a business process or something technical. We're always drawing and revising. So one of the important things is being able to change that as we go. Now, whiteboards make it really easy, but we also have to do that to communicate to external stakeholders, people that depend on us, maybe an operations team, maybe someone that is a client of our API. We need to be able to communicate what is happening internally. We can't just keep everything in our heads. It's important to understand the direction, but to be able to have tools. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be a diagram. You have to find that right balance of writing something down, showing code, showing something in person. There's a balance there.
And this also can be done in a very collaborative style. Again, another story from one of our projects was a situation where they'd been building this large code base, and people were getting a bit uncomfortable about the way in which the dependencies between the various modules was taking shape. So what they decided to do was to first figure out what the problem actually looked like and use a code analysis tool to plot out the dependencies between the major modules. And they saw that and they said, yeah, this is a lot more messy than it should be. So they then got together in a meeting, put the diagram up on the wall and said, okay, what do we want this to look like? And this was the architects on the team plus the senior developers. I don't think it was the entire team because that wouldn't have fitted into any of our meeting rooms, but it was, half a dozen or so of the senior developers. And they ended up drawing a picture of what they felt they ought to look like. And then they went out to the whole development team and said, we want to move in this direction. So whenever you're in the code base and you see one of the dependencies that's currently present but isn't in the direction that we want to head to, we want you to fix it. And do little fixes over the course of the next couple of months. And then over the course of 2 months, the code gradually got into the shape that they wanted it to have in. And then in the last week or whatever, a couple of the senior developers just went in and finished the job off and crossed off all the finalize and T's. And that kind of measure can be very useful, not just because it's a collaborative effort at coming up with what do we want that future to look with, but the fact that everybody is engaged in moving towards that kind of position. And then to make sure that things were caught at the end, they actually put into the build process the ability to fail the build should an illegal dependency crop up. Not necessarily because there weren't any cases, but because they wanted to know if anybody had inserted a dependency that was against what was there in the diagram. So that is the role that tools can play as a verification mechanism to help do that.
So we've been talking a lot about certain aspects of Agile teams, practices that a lot of Agile teams have. And we want to kind of step back and say, what do we see often, and what are some things to kind of end on? What are some suggestions? So one of the things we see a lot is we have these Agile software development projects that are working in an Agile fashion, and then we have maybe this separate group that is doing some sort of architecture. Well, we've suggested some ways that architecture is happening in Agile teams. And I want to call out that it's a two-way street to make sure that architecture is happening. So the developers on the team, in fact, BAs and QAs, project managers, we should all be talking about what we're changing in the project, how it's changing, what's that impacting. We should be talking to people that are external to the project, people that are trying to make sure that architecture is happening. So they know that thinking is happening. But oftentimes we see that there's a responsibility on the team to be reporting or asking for permission for architecture to change. So it is a two-way street for people that have the responsibility to make sure we have a plan and some organization within our software to also participate on teams and utilize some of the practices that are happening already to gain that knowledge and help maybe draw those diagrams or communicate in the right ways by utilizing things that are currently happening that show architectural thinking. We kind of been talking about how architecture is the important things, the things that are hard to change. The good news is there's less that is hard to change, and it's getting more and more easy to change a lot of different things. Martin gave the example of questioning whether databases are hard to change. And now we have the question of whether or not relational is the right thing, and a lot of NoSQL databases are even built in with migration systems. Rails is built in with migrations. So people are adopting change and making that the norm. Things like environment provisioning or infrastructure as a service. These are all things that 10 years ago, 15 years ago would have been in our list in an Inception as hard to change. So that's good that we have less of those, but we still want to be important. We still want to be thinking about what is important in our system. We still want to make sure architectural thinking is happening.
And it's that thinking that is really the most important thing. I mean, we'll talk a lot about different techniques and appropriate architectures and things like that. And we've done a bit of this in this talk. There'll be a lot more of it out there in the conference. But in the end, the most important thing is the will to do this, that you have people who care and that you give them the space and the time to do that. A lot of times, particularly more senior developers, get really overstressed and have to do a gazillion things at once. You're discovering that glorious life at ThoughtWorks now, where there's so many different things you could be doing, and you always, of course, want your best, most experienced people to be doing that fact. But it's important from the whole project management side to make sure that the senior people have time to think about architecture. There are various ways that you can do that. The technique of setting aside time for commit reviews that I mentioned earlier on is one case of that. Another example that I've seen on a few projects is saying that although that the developer, the architect is pairing on stories and taking part in the programming, they're never allowed to sign up and be responsible for a story's delivery. They always have to help other people as opposed to actually taking that role themselves. And that also is a technique that allows a certain amount of provision of time. Because in the end, it's that time and will that is crucial. Because like so many other things in software, getting a good architecture for your system is primarily a people problem.
So with that, we want to say thank you for listening to us. We hope that you have a little bit more context around different things that are probably happening on Agile teams and how they can be utilized to show and demonstrate architectural thinking and to enable those that are already thinking about architecture on your teams.
And if you want to talk to us at all about what we've been talking about, we'll be hanging around the ThoughtWorks booth most of the time. I do have a book signing at the Pearson booth at around 10:30 today. But other than that, I'm going to be around the ThoughtWorks booth during the breaks and, of course, attending lots of talks. And Molly is going to be doing an interesting contest between microservices and monoliths. I'm not quite sure which side you're on. So that grand debate is going to be later on today. And I think you should find that quite interesting if you find that discussion absorbing. And thank you very much.
Thank you.